The mud still clung to her boots when the heir of Ethgard looked her in the eyes and tore the fated bond from her chest in front of the entire pack. He called her a scavenger and chose Silk over the woman the moon had given him. She should have crawled away broken, but she stood. Then the Alpha King stepped out of the shadows. He did not comfort her. He claimed her right there on the blood-soaked stones, in front of the son who had just discarded her and made the tracker his Luna. What followed was not gentle healing, but war rooms, cracked ribs, and a quiet, merciless rise. She saved the very heir who had rejected her, and proved that true strength was forged in steel, not silk. On the night of the winter solstice, before every wolf who had once laughed at her, the Alpha King marked her as his mate and declared that fate had finally been set right. The boy who threw her away now bows to the queen he lost. The great courtyard of Ethgard smelled of roasting venison, damp wolf fur, and the sharp metallic tang of anxiety. Tonight was the blood moon, for the lesser wolves. It was an excuse to drink ale until they vomited in the snow, for the young and unwed. It was the night the goddess tied the invisible tethers of fate. Freya stood near the edge of the firelight. She was a tracker. Her leathers were patched, her knuckles scarred from skinning traps, and her hair was tied back with a simple leather thong. She did not belong in the inner circle where the highborn wolves paraded in velvet and furs, but the scent had pulled her here. Pine needles, crushed ice, and the distinct, overwhelming smell of amber. It was a scent that made her pulse hammer against the sides of her throat. It belonged to Nico, the heir to Ethgard. He stood on the stone dais, flanked by his father's honor guard. Nico was beautiful in the way a hunting blade is beautiful, polished, sharp, and meant to draw blood. He was scanning the crowd, when his pale eyes locked onto Freya. The ambient noise of the courtyard vanished. The pull was undeniable. A physical tug behind her navel hauling her forward. Freya stepped out of the shadows. The crowd parted. They smelled it too. The sudden, violent spike in pheromones that signaled a fated pair. Whispers hissed through the cold air. Freya kept her eyes on Nico. She did not expect love. She expected duty. Fated mates were the bedrock of the pack's strength. You did not argue with the earth. Nico's expression, however, did not soften. It hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. He looked at her mud-caked boots. He looked at the hunting knife strapped to her thigh. Then he looked at Lady Cecily, who stood just a few feet away, draped in crimson silk and smelling of expensive oils. Cecily's father controlled the western borders. Freya's father was buried in an unmarked grave beyond the tree line. Nico descended the steps. The snow crunched under his heavy boots. He stopped a foot away from Freya. The heat radiating from his large frame made her skin prickle. Her wolf clawed at her ribs, desperate for his touch. "You," Nico said, his voice flat, carrying over the silent courtyard. "Me," Freya replied. She kept her chin level. She would not cower. "A cruel joke," he muttered. He did not lower his voice. He wanted the pack to hear. The goddess grows blind in her old age. Ethgard needs a queen, not a scavenger. Freya felt the blood drain from her face. "Do not speak my name." He cut her off. He squared his shoulders, projecting his voice to the hundreds of watching wolves. "I, Nico of Ethgard, heir to the Iron Throne, recognize the bond of the moon." He paused, his eyes drilling into hers with absolute malice. "And I reject it. I reject you, Freya the Tracker. You are not my mate. You will never be my Luna." The words were not just sound. They were physical violence. The tether snapped. It did not fade. It violently ruptured. Freya gasped, her knees buckling as a phantom blade buried itself in her chest. She hit the cobblestones hard, tearing the skin on her palms. It felt like her lungs were filling with hot ash. She could not breathe. Her vision swam. The pack erupted into murmurs, and then a few low, cruel chuckles. The heir had made his choice. Politics over fate. power over the bloodline. Nico turned his back on her. He walked straight toward Lady Cecily and offered her his hand. Cecily took it, her smile a victorious flash of red. Freya stayed on her hands and knees. Blood dripped from her nose, splashing bright red onto the gray stone. The pain was absolute, a cold fire burning out her nervous system, but the cynicism that had kept her alive through harsh winters and empty bellies kicked in. "Breathe," she told herself. "Don't let them see you die." She planted her boot on the stone. Her muscles shook violently, inch by inch. She forced herself upright. She wiped the blood from her lip with the back of her hand, leaving a red smear across her pale skin. She stood alone in the center of the courtyard, broken, humiliated, but on her feet. She turned to leave. She would pack her meager belongings. She would head north. She was a rogue now. A rejected wolf in Ethgard had no protection. Halt. The single word did not boom, but it carried a weight that made the very stones of the courtyard vibrate. The music, the whispering, the crunching of boots, everything ceased. The silence was instantaneous and absolute. From the shadows of the High Keep's archway, Alaric stepped into the torchlight. The Alpha King. He did not wear ceremonial velvet. He wore the battered steel breastplate he had practically lived in for 2 decades. His dark hair was heavily salted with gray, pulled back tightly. His face was a map of old wars, a jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow and down to his jawline. Alaric did not possess Nico's polished beauty. He possessed gravity. When he walked, the air pressure in the courtyard seemed to drop. Wolves instinctively lowered their heads, baring their necks in submission. Even Nico dropped Cecily's hand and bowed his head. "Father." Alaric ignored his son. He walked slowly, his heavy boots making no sound on the snow. He bypassed the dais entirely and walked to the center of the courtyard, stopping directly in front of Freya. Freya's breath hitched. She was tall for a woman, but Alaric dwarfed her. Up close he smelled of wood smoke, old blood, and a terrifying ancient power. She expected him to finish the job, to banish her formally so his son's new political mating could proceed without the stain of a rejected mate hovering on the edges of the territory. "Look at me," Alaric commanded. His voice was gravel and low thunder. Freya forced her eyes up. His eyes were a startling, piercing gold. They were not warm. They were analytical. He looked at the blood on her chin. He looked at her trembling hands. Then he looked at her eyes, seeing the utter devastation she was trying to lock behind a wall of pure spite. "You stand," Alaric noted quietly. It was not a question. "I have legs." "My king," Freya rasped, her throat raw from the severed bond. A muscle feathered in Alaric's jaw. It might have been amusement. It might have been fury. He finally turned his massive head to look at his son. "A rejection," Alaric said, his voice carrying effortlessly. "On the night of the blood moon, you spit on the goddess." Nico stiffened. "Father, she is a nobody, a dirt scratcher. Ethgard needs alliances. Cecily brings 2,000 fighting wolves to our banners. The earth made a mistake. I corrected it. You corrected the earth." Alaric repeated the words slowly, tasting the sheer arrogance in them. A boy who has never bled in a real war thinks he knows better than the soil that feeds him. "It is done," Nico said, his voice rising defensively. "The bond is broken." "Yes, it is." Alaric turned back to Freya. He understood the rot. A pack that ignored the fundamental laws of their kind in favor of political convenience was a pack preparing to die. He had spent 30 years bleeding into the mud of Ethgard to keep it strong. He would not watch his entitled whelp of a son dismantle its foundations because he wanted a perfumed bride instead of a survivor. Alaric reached out. He did not use claws. His large, calloused hand cupped the side of Freya's face. Freya flinched. The heat of his skin was shocking against the freezing night air. But there was no pain, only a heavy, grounding anchor. "You survived the severing without screaming," Alaric said, his thumb brushing a speck of blood from the corner of her mouth. "You stood up when a lesser wolf would have lain down to die." "I am used to the cold," Freya whispered. confused, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her bruised ribs. "Good," Alaric said. He turned his body, keeping one hand firmly on Freya's shoulder, pulling her slightly behind him. He faced Nico and the rest of the stunned pack. "The heir has made his choice. He claims the West," Alaric declared, his voice ringing off the stone walls. "But Ethgard will not disrespect the moon. The bloodline requires a wolf chosen by the earth, a wolf of grit, a wolf of stone." Nico took a step forward, his face pale. "Father, what are you doing?" Alaric did not answer him. He looked down at Freya. "I, Alaric, Alpha of Ethgard, king of the northern reaches. Claim this woman." The words struck the courtyard like a physical blow. Several wolves gasped. Lady Cecily covered her mouth. Nico looked as though he had been struck by a hammer. "She is severed," Alaric continued, his gold eyes blazing as his wolf pushed to the surface. "Her slate is wiped clean by the heir's own tongue. Therefore, I take her. She is my mate. She is your Luna. Anyone who questions this will speak to my blade." The walk up the hundreds of stone steps to the Alpha's keep was a blur to Freya. Her mind was completely fractured. One half of her brain was still bleeding from Nico's rejection, mourning a phantom future. The other half was hyper-fixated on the massive, silent man walking beside her. Alaric had not spoken since he made the declaration. He simply kept his hand clamped around her upper arm, not tight enough to bruise, but firm enough to ensure she did not stumble. The heavy oak doors of his private chambers shut behind them with a resounding boom, sealing out the noise of the chaotic courtyard below. The room was Spartan. No tapestries, no gilded mirrors, just a massive hearth roaring with a pine fire. A heavy oak table covered in maps, and a sprawling bed draped in thick bear pelts. It was the room of a warlord, not a king of comfort. Alaric released her arm and walked straight to a sideboard. He poured a heavy measure of amber liquid into a crude iron cup. He did not offer her a seat. He did not offer her comforting words. He turned and held the cup out to her. Freya stood frozen near the door. "Is it poisoned?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly. Alaric let out a short, harsh breath that might have been a laugh. "If I wanted you dead, tracker, I would have let you walk into the snow. Drink it. It will numb the ache in your chest." She hesitated, then stepped forward and took the cup. Her fingers brushed his. His skin was rough and scarred. She brought the cup to her lips and downed it. It burned like hellfire, tracing a hot line down her throat. But within seconds, the agonizing hollow pain in her ribs dulled to a manageable throb. She slammed the iron cup onto the table. "Why?" Alaric walked to the hearth, resting his massive forearm against the stone mantel, staring into the flames. "Why did I claim you? Or why did I humiliate my son?" "Both. Because he is a fool," Alaric said plainly. "He thinks power comes from the West, from gold and silk, and men who fight with clean swords. Power comes from the root, Freya. The goddess matched him with a tracker because he lacks instinct. He lacks grit. He is soft. He rejected the very thing he needed to survive the coming years." He turned to face her. The firelight caught the harsh angles of his face. "If I let a severed mate walk out of my gates, it signals to the neighboring packs that we no longer honor the old laws. It signals weakness. I do not tolerate weakness, so I'm a political prop," Freya said, crossing her arms, her cynical armor snapping back into place. "A symbol of your piety to the old laws. You could have just ordered him to keep me." "I could have," Alaric agreed. "But he would have despised you. He would have treated you like a dog. You would have withered." He paused, his golden eyes sweeping over her in a slow, deliberate assessment. "And Ethgard does not need a withered queen." "I am not a queen," Freya shot back. "I skin rabbits. I sleep in the dirt. I don't know how to host a winter solstice ball." Alaric pushed off the mantle and closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. Freya forced herself not to back away. He stopped just inches from her. The sheer size of him, the sheer physical dominance of his aura, was suffocating. Yet beneath the scent of blood and pine, there was something deeply steadying. He was not a volatile boy like Nico. He was bedrock, I have enough courtiers who can throw a ball, Alaric said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. I need a Luna who knows when a winter is going to be harsh. I need a woman who can look at a line of trees and tell me if an enemy is hiding in the brush. I need someone who takes a fatal blow to the chest and stands back up. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, when she did not. He rested his heavy hand on the back of her neck, his thumb resting against her pulse point. His touch sent a strange, dark shiver down her spine. It was not the frantic, magical spark of a fated mate. It was heavier. It was a choice. You are broken right now, Alaric said, his tone devoid of pity, filled only with brutal truth. The severing will ache for months, but you will heal. You will sit beside me. You will learn the politics of the High Keep, and you will teach my soft court what it means to be a wolf of the forest. Freya looked up into his scarred face. She had lost a boy who did not want her. She had been claimed by a monster who needed her. And Nico? She asked softly. Alaric's eyes darkened, the gold bleeding into a dangerous black. Nico made his bed. Now he will have to watch you rule from mine. The severing fever hit her an hour before dawn. It started as a dull ache in her marrow and rapidly escalated into a violent, rattling chill. Freya awoke violently, gasping for air, her fingers clawing at the thick bear pelts covering the massive bed. It felt as though a rusted hook was buried behind her sternum, dragging her toward the courtyard where the bond had been broken. Her body was going through withdrawal. It demanded Nico. It demanded the mate the earth had chosen. Freya rolled onto her side, curling her knees to her chest. She bit down hard on her own wrist to keep from screaming. Breathe! The voice came from the shadows near the hearth. Alaric. He was already dressed in his leather breeches and a heavy linen shirt. He sat in a high-backed wooden chair, a whetstone rhythmic against the edge of a broadsword. He did not rush to her side. He did not offer empty platitudes. He simply watched her with those analytical gold eyes. It feels, Freya choked out, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached, like my veins are full of crushed glass. The earth punishes those who break its laws, Alaric replied evenly. He set the sword aside and walked to the sideboard, pouring a glass of water from an iron pitcher. He brought it to the edge of the bed. Your wolf is mourning. Let it mourn, but do not let it drag you under. Freya pushed herself up on one trembling arm. She took the glass. Her fingers brushed his, and again that heavy, grounding anchor of his presence pushed back against the frantic static in her mind. She drank deeply. The water was freezing, shocking her system. How long? She rasped, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. A month. Maybe 2, Alaric said. He stepped back, giving her space. It depends on how much you dwell on a boy who wasn't man enough to keep you. Freya flinched. The bluntness was brutal, but it was exactly what she needed. Pity would have destroyed her. Anger kept her blood pumping. She swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her bare feet hit the cold stone floor. She was wearing a loose tunic Alaric had tossed to her the night before. It smelled like him, wood smoke and iron. A timid knock echoed against the heavy oak doors. Enter, Alaric commanded. A young servant girl no older than 16 slipped into the room. She kept her eyes glued to the floor, carrying an armful of crimson silk and white velvet. For the Luna, she whispered, her voice trembling. For the morning meal. Freya stared at the delicate fabrics. They were beautiful. They were the kind of clothes Cecily wore. Clothes meant for sitting, for looking pretty, for bleeding quietly if someone stuck a knife in your ribs. No, Freya said. The servant girl froze, her eyes darting up in panic. My lady, I said no. Freya stood up. Her legs were shaky, but she locked her knees. I cannot run in silk. I cannot fight in velvet. Where are my leathers? They were taken to the wash. My lady. They were covered in mud and blood. Freya looked at Alaric. The king was watching her, leaning against one of the bedposts. He did not intervene. He was waiting to see how she handled her first test of authority. Find them, Freya told the girl, her voice dropping into a steady, hard cadence. Clean them if you must, but bring them back. And find me a fresh tunic, linen, something a hunting dog couldn't tear through in one bite. The girl swallowed hard, bowed hastily, and scurried out of the room, taking the useless silk with her. Alaric pushed off the bedpost. A faint, grim smile touched the corners of his scarred mouth. The court expects a queen in finery. The court expects a scavenger. Freya corrected him. If I wear their silk, I am playing their game, and I don't know the rules. If I wear my leathers, I am playing mine. Good. Alaric picked up his sword and slid it into the scabbard at his hip. Let us go disappoint the highborns. The great hall was a cavernous space of vaulted ceilings, roaring fireplaces, and long oak tables. Hundreds of wolves were already seated when the heavy doors swung open. The ambient roar of conversation snapped into dead silence. Alaric walked in first. Freya walked a half step behind his right shoulder. She wore her old dark leathers, scrubbed clean of yesterday's mud, but still bearing the scuffs and scars of the deep woods. A fresh, dark green linen tunic hung to her mid-thigh. Her hunting knife was strapped to her leg. She felt the weight of 1,000 eyes. She smelled the sharp spikes of disdain, curiosity, and fear. At the high table, Nico sat near the center. Next to him sat Lady Cecily, radiant in pale blue silk. When Nico saw Freya, his jaw clenched so hard a muscle jumped beneath his cheek. The sight of her wearing the king's colors, standing at his father's side, was a public brand of his failure. Alaric did not pause. He walked to the head of the table. The seat beside him, the Luna's chair, carved with the crest of a howling wolf, had sat empty for 15 years. He pulled it out. Freya stepped forward and sat. The wood was hard against her back. Alaric took his own seat. Eat, he ordered the hall. Slowly, the clatter of silverware resumed, though the murmurs remained hushed. Servants rushed forward, placing platters of roasted boar, sharp cheeses, and dark bread on the high table. Freya grabbed a piece of bread and tore it in half. She was starving. The severing fever had burned through her reserves. It is bold. Cecily's high, clear voice cut through the noise of the high table. She leaned forward, looking past Nico to smile sweetly at Freya. To wear tracking gear to the high table. Is it a southern custom, Lady Freya? Freya stopped chewing. She looked at Cecily. The woman's smile was flawless, but her scent was chaotic. No, Freya said simply. Cecily's smile strained. Perhaps the king's seamstresses have not had time to take your measurements. I would be happy to lend you something appropriate. A Luna must project strength. After all, not destitution. A few low snickers erupted from the nobles seated further down the table. Nico looked down at his plate, refusing to meet Freya's eyes, but his chest puffed out slightly at Cecily's defense of their status. Freya swallowed her bread. She leaned forward, mimicking Cecily's posture. She let her senses expand. In the woods. She tracked prey by reading the invisible signs. In the keep. The signs were just louder. You smell like lavender and heavy musk. Lady Cecily, Freya said, her voice carrying just enough for the high table to hear. It's a very expensive perfume from the port cities, I imagine. Cecily touched her throat, looking pleased. It is. It's strong. Freya continued, her eyes locking onto Cecily's, strong enough to almost hide the sour smell of cold sweat. Your pulse is beating frantically against your collarbone. You are terrified. Cecily's face drained of color. I am not. You have 2,000 swords behind you, a new mate, and a seat at the high table. Yet you are shaking in your silk because a tracker wearing battered leather just sat in the chair you thought you would inherit. Freya did not raise her voice. She did not sound angry. She sounded entirely factual. Keep your dresses. Cecily, I prefer armor that actually protects me. The silence at the high table was absolute. Nico finally looked up, his pale eyes wide with shock. He had expected the quiet, submissive girl from the courtyard. He had not realized that a wolf pushed into a corner only has teeth left. Next to Freya, Alaric reached out and took a thick slice of roasted boar from the platter. He did not look at Cecily. He did not look at Nico. Pass the salt. Luna, Alaric said calmly. Freya handed him the iron dish. The conversation at the table did not resume. The war room smelled of old dust, melting wax, and stale aggression. A massive map of the northern reaches was spread across a sprawling table of scarred elm. Small wooden blocks painted in the colors of different packs marked borders, garrisons, and supply lines. Freya stood quietly in the corner, her back against the cool stone wall. It had been 3 days since the breakfast in the great hall. The severing fever had passed its peak, leaving behind a hollow, dull ache that only flared when Nico entered a room. Alaric had brought her here without explanation. He simply told her to stand, watch, and listen. Currently, the room was thick with shouting. "They are testing us!" Nico slammed his fist onto the table, making the wooden blocks rattle. 3 supply wagons hit in a week near the Whispering Pines. The Red Fang Pack thinks because we are focused on the winter solstice. We are blind to the eastern border. Standing across from him, a grizzled scout named Brown shook his head. Mud was caked up to his knees, and he looked exhausted. "My lord, we didn't find Red Fang's scents. The rain washed most of the tracks away. All we found were torn throats and missing grain. It could be rogues." "Rogues don't coordinate 3 strikes in 7 days, Nico snapped, pacing the length of the table. He was desperate to prove his military acumen, especially with Cecily's father, Lord Holstead, watching from the sidelines. "It is an organized push. We need to march a vanguard of 200 men straight through the pines and burn the nearest Red Fang outpost. A show of force. Marching 200 men through the pines right now is suicide," Freya said. She had not meant to speak. The words slipped out of her mouth before the cynical, self-preserving part of her brain could stop them. Every head in the room snapped toward her. The generals looked appalled. Lord Holstead sneered. Nico stopped pacing, his face flushing dark red. "Who gave the tracker permission to speak in a war council?" Nico demanded, looking to his father. Alaric sat at the head of the table. He had not spoken in 20 minutes. He simply watched the map at Nico's outburst. Alaric slowly lifted his gaze. He did not look at his son. He looked at Freya. "Step forward. Freya," the king ordered. Freya pushed off the wall, her heart hammered against her ribs. She was entirely out of her depth in a room full of lords and generals, but she was not out of her depth when it came to the woods. She walked to the edge of the table and looked down at the map. "Explain," Alaric said. Freya pointed to the painted green expanse labeling the Whispering Pines. "It has rained for 5 days straight," she said, her voice steadying as she focused on the terrain. "The pines sit in a basin. The river that cuts through it flooded its banks 2 days ago. I smelled the silt on the wind this morning." She looked up at Nico. "The main road through the pines is completely submerged in 3 feet of freezing mud. If you march 200 men in heavy armor down that road, they will sink to their calves. They won't be able to form a shield wall. They won't be able to retreat. You will bottleneck your own vanguard." Nico's jaw tightened. "A wolf of Ethgard does not fear mud. A dead wolf doesn't fear anything," Freya shot back, losing her patience. "If it's an organized force, they won't meet you on the road. They'll be up in the canopy or waiting on the high ridges of the basin. They will shoot your men down like fish in a barrel while they struggle to pull their boots out of the muck." Lord Holstead crossed his arms. "And what does a girl who hunts rabbits suggest? That we do nothing?" "No," Freya said. She looked at Brahm, the exhausted scout. "You said the throats were torn, but the wagons were stripped of grain. Did they take the horses?" Brahm blinked, surprised to be addressed. "No, my lady. The horses were slaughtered too, left to rot." Freya looked back at the map. "Wolves take meat. If they left hundreds of pounds of fresh horse meat to rot, they weren't hungry, and if they took grain, they are feeding humans or hiding them." She tapped a finger on a jagged mountain range just north of the pines. "The Red Fang Pack doesn't employ human mercenaries, but the rogue warlords in the crags do. It's not a border push. It's a staging ground. They are stealing supplies to sustain a camp." The room went dead silent. The generals leaned over the map, tracing the lines Freya had just connected. The logic was tight. It was built on Earth, weather, and basic survival mechanics, things the Highborns often overlooked in favor of grand military strategy. Nico opened his mouth to argue, but Alaric raised a single massive hand. The air snapped his mouth shut. Alaric stood up. He loomed over the table, his gold eyes tracing the basin, the river, and the crags. "Braum," the king growled. "Yes, my king. Take 10 light-footed scouts, circle the basin, do not engage, find the camp." Alaric looked up, his gaze sweeping over his generals. "We do not march 200 men into a bog. We wait until we have a location, and then we strike the head off the snake in the dark." The council nodded in unison. Holstead looked grudgingly impressed. Nico looked as though he had swallowed a wasp. "Council dismissed," Alaric said. The lords and generals quickly filed out of the room. Nico lingered for a moment, glaring at Freya with a mixture of hatred and profound confusion, before spinning on his heel and marching out, slamming the heavy door behind him. Freya let out a long breath she had not realized she was holding. Her shoulders slumped slightly. She stepped back from the table, preparing to retreat to her corner. "You read the terrain," Alaric said. His voice was low, echoing in the empty room. "I have spent my life in it," Freya replied, keeping her eyes on the wooden blocks. "You don't survive the deep winters by ignoring the water lines." Alaric walked around the edge of the large table. He did not stop until he was standing right in front of her. The sheer mass of him blocked out the light from the hearth. Freya tilted her head up to look at him. There was a new intensity in his gaze. It was not the cold assessment from the courtyard. It was something sharper, something territorial. "My son looks at a map and sees lines to conquer," Alaric said softly, his voice a deep rumble in his chest. "You look at a map and see the blood, the mud, and the weather. You see the reality. Reality is all I have." Alaric raised his hand. His knuckles were heavily scarred, the skin rough like coarse leather. He brushed the back of his hand against her cheek. The touch was startlingly gentle for a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite. "You fought for your space in this room today," Alaric told her. "You did not ask for permission. You took it." Freya swallowed hard. The proximity was intoxicating. Her pulse leaped, not with the magical, sickeningly sweet pull of a fated mate, but with the raw, undeniable electricity of being seen, being valued. "I am a tracker," she whispered, her voice betraying a slight tremor. "I follow the tracks." Alaric leaned down, his face mere inches from hers. The scent of him, wood smoke, cold iron, and dangerous power, enveloped her completely. "You are my queen," he corrected her, his golden eyes blazing with a fierce, possessive fire. "And you have just taught my generals how to war." He did not kiss her. He did not need to. The air between them practically hummed with the sheer force of what was building. He stepped back, leaving Freya breathless and entirely unmoored. "Go to the armory," Alaric commanded, turning back toward the maps. "Tell the smith to fit you for a chain shirt. If we are riding into the crags, you are riding with me." The armory was a suffocating cavern of heat, deafening hammer strikes, and the sharp scent of hot steel. Garrick, the master smith, was a man built like a boulder. He did not bow when Freya entered. He merely stopped his hammering and stared at her. The pack gossip had already reached the lower levels of the keep. The tracker who became a queen, the mudblood Luna, the king-ordered chain, Freya said, raising her voice over the roar of the forge. "Lightweight. I need to be able to turn my torso without it biting into my ribs." Garrick grunted. He wiped his soot-stained hands on a leather apron and approached her. He threw a measuring tape around her chest with rough efficiency, calling out numbers to an apprentice. "You won't carry a broadsword," Garrick stated flatly. It was not a question. "Hunting knives," Freya corrected. "A pair. 7-inch blades. I need sheaths built into the belt. I draw from the hip, not the back." The smith paused, his thick eyebrows knitting together. He looked at her scarred knuckles and the calluses on her palms. He did not see a noblewoman playing dress-up. He saw a killer. "I have a mail shirt forged from northern iron. Small rings. Won't stop a heavy axe. But it will turn a glancing blade or an arrow. Fetch it." As Garrick disappeared into the back racks, The heavy wooden door of the armory creaked open. Nico stepped inside. He wore a heavy fur cloak clasped with the silver wolf of Ethgard. His pale eyes instantly found Freya. The hostility radiating off him was thick enough to choke on. "You are making a mockery of our traditions," Nico said softly, walking toward her. The apprentice scrambled out of his way, vanishing into the shadows. Freya did not turn to face him entirely. She kept her posture relaxed, leaning slightly against a wooden work table. "I was unaware surviving an ambush was against tradition." "Do not speak to me as an equal," Nico hissed, stopping 3 feet away. His fists were clenched at his sides. "My father is using you to punish me. Once he grows bored of this little game, you will be nothing. You have no bloodline, no power." "You are right," Freya agreed, her voice devoid of emotion. "I have no bloodline. I have a heartbeat, and right now, it beats under your father's protection because you rejected it." Nico flinched as if struck. The severing still hurt him too, though his pride would never let him admit it. The earth had woven them together, and he had ripped the fabric apart. "You don't belong in a war party," Nico snarled, leaning closer, trying to use his height to intimidate her. "You belong in the dirt, skinning rats. If you ride with us tomorrow, you will be a liability. I will not have my men die trying to protect a peasant." Freya finally turned her head, looking him dead in the eye. The lingering ache in her chest pulsed, a phantom memory of what should have been her mate. She killed the feeling instantly. She let the cynical, frozen core of her survival instinct take over. "If I fall tomorrow—" "Nico," Freya said softly, "leave me to bleed. I will expect no less from you. But if you fall, remember that it was the peasant who warned you about the mud." Garrick returned, holding a pile of shimmering gray metal. He dumped it onto the table between them, the heavy clatter silencing the air. "Put it on," the smith ordered Freya, completely ignoring Nico. Freya stripped off her linen tunic without hesitation, standing in her thin undershirt. She pulled the chain shirt over her head. It was freezing against her skin, heavy and oppressive. It settled onto her shoulders with a brutal weight. She rolled her neck, testing the range of motion. It pinched near the collar, but it would hold. Nico stared at her for a long second, his face a mask of conflicting fury and revulsion. Then he turned and stormed out of the armory. By dawn, the cold rain had turned to freezing sleet. The courtyard was a sea of gray and black. 50 elite riders sat atop massive war horses, their breath pluming in the freezing air. There were no banners. There were no trumpets. This was not a parade. It was an execution block on wheels. Alaric sat astride a towering black destrier. He wore blackened plate armor over his chest and shoulders, a heavy broadsword strapped to his saddle. He looked like the god of war, a terrifying anchor point in the swirling sleet. Freya rode a sturdy, short-legged roan. It was not pretty, but it was sure-footed. She wore her dark leathers over the chain shirt. A thick wool cloak pulled tight around her throat. Her twin hunting knives were strapped to her hips. Alaric spurred his horse, walking the line of his men. When he reached Freya, he stopped. He looked at the chainmail peeking out from her collar. He looked at the hard, dead focus in her eyes. "Keep to the center of the column," Alaric ordered, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Do not break rank unless I give the command. I know how to ride in the dark." "Alaric," she replied, gripping the wet leather reins. A muscle feathered in his jaw at the use of his name. It was the first time she had not called him King or Alpha. He did not correct her. "See that you do," he said. He spurred his massive horse to the front of the column. He raised a single gauntleted hand. The heavy iron gates of Ethgard ground open. The ride was agonizing. For 12 hours they pushed north, bypassing the main roads just as Freya had advised. They rode through the dense timberline, navigating the jagged, uneven terrain of the mountain base. The cold seeped into Freya's bones. Her thighs burned, and the chainmail rubbed a raw patch against her collarbone. Nobody spoke. The Ethgard vanguard communicated through hand signals and silence, as twilight set in, painting the sky the color of a bruised plum. Brahm held up a clenched fist. The column halted instantly. The scout rode back to Alaric. "Half a mile up the ridge." "My king," Brahm whispered. "A ravine. 4 watchfires. About 40 men, heavily armed. Human mercenaries mixed with a few rogue wolves. They have wagons of our grain covered under tarps." Alaric nodded. He unsheathed his broadsword. The scrape of steel against leather was deafening in the quiet woods. Behind him, 50 swords cleared their scabbards in unison. "We do not take prisoners," Alaric told his men, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "Burn the grain, slaughter the thieves. Leave their heads on pikes for the Red Fang Pack to find." The descent into the ravine was completely silent. The Ethgard wolves dismounted, tying their horses a quarter-mile back. They moved through the craggy rocks like ghosts. Freya stayed low, her boots finding solid stone without dislodging a single pebble. This was her element. The dark, the cold, the hunt. Beneath them, the rogue camp was a mess of haphazard tents and dying fires. The smell of cheap ale and unwashed bodies drifted up the ridge. The mercenaries felt safe. They thought the weather and the terrain would keep the high pack at bay. They were wrong. Alaric raised his sword. He did not yell a battle cry. He simply dropped the blade forward. The vanguard poured over the edge of the ridge like a flood of black water. The chaos was instantaneous. The mercenaries barely had time to draw their weapons before the Ethgard wolves were among them. It was a slaughter. Heads rolled. Throats were torn out by men who shifted mid-stride, turning into massive, hulking beasts that tore through the human mercenaries like paper. Freya did not shift. She stayed in her skin, keeping her profile small. A massive mercenary with a scarred face charged at her, swinging a heavy iron mace. He bellowed, expecting the small woman in a wool cloak to cower. Freya did not cower. She did not block. Blocking a mace with a knife would shatter her arm. She dropped into a brutal crouch, letting the heavy mace swing violently over her head, the wind of it whipping her hair, as the man's momentum carried him forward, exposing his side. Freya drove upward. Her left knife sank into the soft tissue just below his armpit, tearing upward into his lung. The man choked, blood bubbling over his lips. He dropped the mace. Freya twisted the blade, ripping it out, and kicked him hard in the back of the knee. He collapsed. She moved past him before he even hit the dirt, scanning the chaos for the next threat. The violence was deafening, the wet tearing of flesh, the screaming, the heavy thuds of bodies hitting the frozen mud, through the smoke of a kicked-over campfire. Freya saw Nico. He was fighting fiercely, his silver broadsword a blur of motion. He had already dropped 3 men, but he was fighting like a tournament champion, not a survivor. He was making grand, sweeping strikes, overextending his guard. A rogue wolf trapped in half-shift, a grotesque hybrid of fur, elongated limbs, and sharp claws, was flanking him. The creature was using the smoke as cover, creeping up behind the air while Nico was busy parrying a mercenary in front. The cynical voice in Freya's head told her to let it happen. Let the arrogant boy bleed. Let the earth correct its mistake. But a dead heir meant political ruin. It meant Ethgard looked weak, and Freya refused to be part of a weak pack. She sprinted. "Nico, left!" she screamed, her voice cracking over the din of battle. Nico did not react fast enough. The rogue lunged, its massive jaws snapping toward the back of Nico's neck. Freya hit the rogue from the side in a flying tackle of pure momentum. She was not strong enough to knock the massive beast down, but the impact threw off its trajectory. The rogue's teeth snapped shut on empty air, missing Nico's spine by an inch. The beast snarled, whipping its head around to face Freya. It backhanded her with a heavy, clawed fist. The blow caught her square in the ribs. The chainmail held, preventing the claws from disemboweling her, but the sheer kinetic force cracked bone. Freya flew backward, slamming hard into the wooden wheel of a stolen grain wagon. The breath was punched out of her lungs in a violent rush. The rogue stalked toward her, raising its claws for a killing strike. Before it could swing, A massive shadow eclipsed the firelight. Alaric. He did not swing his sword. He did not bother. He dropped his blade and caught the rogue's descending wrist with his bare hand. The sound of bones shattering echoed sharply. The rogue shrieked. Alaric stepped in, closing the distance, and drove his armored fist straight into the creature's throat, crushing its windpipe instantly. The beast crumpled to the dirt, gagging on its own blood. The fighting around them was already dying down. The vanguard had done its work. The camp was a graveyard of broken bodies and burning tents. Nico stood a few feet away, panting heavily, his sword dripping red. He stared at the dead rogue, then at Freya, who was struggling to pull air into her battered lungs. He realized exactly what had happened. The peasant had just saved his life. The realization made him look sick. He turned away, marching toward the center of the camp, shouting at his men to secure the perimeter. Alaric knelt beside Freya. The king was covered in gore. A shallow cut on his cheek bled sluggishly, adding to his collection of scars. He did not ask if she was all right. He could hear her fractured breathing. He reached out with his massive hands, surprisingly gentle, and probed her ribs. Freya hissed, squeezing her eyes shut. Too cracked, I think. She gasped. Chainmail did its job. You kept your feet, Alaric said roughly. You saw the flank. You moved. I warned him. Freya wheezed, her head spinning from the pain and adrenaline crash. He didn't listen. Alaric unclasped a waterskin from his belt and held it to her lips. She drank greedily, the cold water soothing her raw throat. He is a fool who fights for glory, Alaric said, his golden eyes locking onto hers. You fight for air. There is a difference. He stood up, towering over her. He offered her his hand. It was slick with blood, not his own. Freya looked at the massive, scarred hand. She did not hesitate. She grabbed his forearm, and he hauled her to her feet with effortless strength. Her ribs screamed in protest, but she locked her knees and stood tall. Alaric did not let go of her arm immediately. He looked at the blood on her face, at the wild, feral look in her eyes that mirrored his own. The connection between them felt entirely different now. It was not just a political claim anymore. It was forged in the dirt, sealed in violence. Go sit by the fire. My queen, Alaric murmured, his thumb brushing a streak of soot from her cheekbone. The war council is finished. Tomorrow we burn the wagons and go home. The ride back to Ethgard was a slow, agonizing crawl. The freezing rain had stopped, replaced by a brittle, bone-chilling wind that whipped through the pines. Freya rode in the center of the column. Every step her roan took sent a jarring spike of agony through her cracked ribs. She did not complain. She did not ask for a halt. She gripped the leather reins until her knuckles turned white and focused entirely on the steaming breath of the horse in front of her. The vanguard was quiet. It was not the tense, predatory silence of the ride out. It was the heavy, exhausted quiet of men who had survived a slaughter. When the iron gates of Ethgard finally ground open, the courtyard was packed. The pack had smelled the blood on the wind hours ago. Families waited nervously to see who would not be returning. Alaric rode in first. The crowd parted. Nico followed a few paces behind, his face pale and drawn beneath the dirt and dried gore. Then came the rest of the column. The horses limping, the men exhausted, as Freya rode through the gates. The whispers began. They pointed at her battered leathers. The soot smeared across her face, and the blood on her twin blades. But the tone of the whispers had shifted. It was no longer the mocking, cruel sound of the courtyard rejection. It was the low, hesitant murmur of respect. Braum, the veteran scout riding to her left, slowed his horse. He looked at Freya, his weathered face deadpan. He did not say a word. He just tapped his closed fist against his chest, right over his heart, and inclined his head, a salute. Freya swallowed the lump forming in her throat and nodded back. Cecily pushed her way to the front of the crowd. She wore a pristine white woolen gown, completely out of place in the mud and the blood. Nico, she cried, rushing toward the heir's horse. She reached up. her hands fluttering over his blood-stained boots. "You're hurt. The goddess be praised. You are alive." Nico dismounted heavily. He did not pull Cecily into an embrace. He looked down at her spotless white dress, and then he looked across the courtyard at Freya. Freya was struggling to dismount, her breath hitching as her boots hit the cobblestones. Nico gently but firmly pushed Cecily's hands away. "I am fine," he muttered, his voice hollow. "See to the men." He walked past his mate, leaving her standing bewildered in the snow. An hour later, the heavy oak doors of the king's chambers slammed shut. Sealing out the noise of the keep, Freya stood by the hearth. The fire had been stoked, radiating a desperate heat. She was trying to unbuckle her leather armor, but her fingers were numb, and every time she raised her arms, her ribs screamed, "Stop!" Alaric stepped out of the shadows. He had already stripped off his blackened plate. He wore only his linen breeches, his massive chest and back a tapestry of jagged white scars. He walked over to her, his bare feet making no sound on the stone. He brushed her trembling hands away, with efficient, practiced movements. He unbuckled the leather straps. He pulled the heavy tunic over her head, leaving her in her undershirt and the heavy chainmail. "Lift your arms," he ordered softly. Freya gritted her teeth and raised her arms. Alaric gripped the bottom edge of the chainmail. He pulled it up and over her head in one smooth, steady motion. The sudden release of the oppressive weight made Freya sway. Alaric caught her. His large hands gripped her bare shoulders. He guided her to sit on the edge of the sprawling bed. He retrieved a roll of clean linen bandages and a jar of pungent, crushed herbs from a chest near the hearth. He knelt on the stone floor between her knees. He did not ask for permission. He gently lifted the hem of her undershirt, exposing the dark, ugly bruising spreading across her left rib cage. "Two cracked, one fractured," Alaric murmured, his golden eyes assessing the damage. "You will not ride for a month. You will not train for 2. I am fine." Freya lied, her voice breathless. "You are a terrible liar," Alaric replied. He scooped a dollop of the herbal salve onto his fingers. "This will burn. Hold still." He pressed his fingers against her bruised skin. The salve felt like liquid ice, searing at first, then rapidly numbing the deep, throbbing ache. The relief was instantaneous, but more potent than the herbs was the physical reality of the king kneeling before her. This was the warlord of the northern reaches, the man who had crushed a rogue's throat with his bare hands just hours ago. Now he was carefully binding her ribs, wrapping the linen tightly around her torso, his touch incredibly gentle. "Why did you jump?" Alaric asked, his voice a low rumble, keeping his eyes on the bandages. Freya did not feign ignorance. "He is the heir. If he falls, Ethgard fractures. We look weak. Holstead would seize the western borders within a week." Alaric tied off the bandage. He did not pull away. He looked up, his face inches from hers. "You saved a boy who publicly threw you to the wolves. You broke your bones for a pack that laughed at you." "I broke my bones for the dirt," Freya whispered, her cynic's armor finally cracking. "For the reality of it. Because if the pack falls, the winter takes us all." Alaric raised his hand, his thumb tracing the sharp line of her jaw. The heat between them was no longer a slow simmer. It was a roar, the phantom ache of the severed bond, the cold. Empty cavern Nico had left behind was gone. It had been burned out, replaced by the crushing gravity of the man in front of her. "He came to my solar an hour ago," Alaric said quietly. Freya blinked. "Nico? He asked to speak with you. He wanted to offer his formal gratitude." Alaric's eyes darkened. "I told him if he ever approached my queen without an invitation, I would strip him of his title and banish him to the crags. Alaric, he made his choice." "Freya." Alaric stood up, pulling her to her feet with him. The sheer mass of him enveloped her. "And I made mine." He did not wait for her to speak. He closed the remaining distance and kissed her. It was not a tentative, questioning kiss. It was absolute. It tasted of wood smoke, old blood, and a terrifying ancient power. Freya gasped, her hands instinctively clutching his broad shoulders. A wolf, which had been whimpering in the dark since the severing suddenly howled to life, locking on to the king's dominating aura. Fate had made a mistake. Alaric was the correction. The winter solstice ball was the political heart of Ethgard. The great hall was transformed. 1,000-year-old tapestries depicting the first wolf packs hung from the rafters. The long oak tables were pushed back to make room for dancing, and hundreds of thick tallow candles cast a warm golden glow over the assembly. The lords and ladies of the northern reaches were dressed in their finest silks, velvets and furs. Nico and Cecily stood near the hearth. Cecily looked radiant in emerald silk, but her smile was tight and strained. Nico looked miserable. He had not spoken more than a dozen words since they returned from the crags. The lords who once fawned over him were now whispering behind their goblets, their eyes constantly darting toward the heavy wooden doors. The loud crack of a ceremonial staff striking the stone floor silenced the hall. "The Alpha King!" the herald shouted, and the Luna of Ethgard. The doors swung open. Alaric walked in. He wore black velvet. A heavy cloak of direwolf fur draped over his shoulders, and the iron crown of Ethgard resting on his brow. He looked like the harsh winter itself, unforgiving, brutal, and magnificent. Beside him walked Freya. A collective breath hitched in the room. She did not wear silk. She wore a gown of midnight blue wool, tailored perfectly to her tall frame. It was thick, warm, and practical. But over the bodice, woven into the fabric itself, were thin, shimmering rings of northern steel, a beautiful, subtle chainmail. She wore a belt of polished iron, and instead of jewels at her throat, she wore the silver clasp of the royal house. She looked like a queen forged for war. Alaric kept his hand firmly on the small of her back as they descended the steps. The crowd parted, bowing low. When they reached the center of the hall, Lord Holstead stepped forward. He held a silver goblet of wine, his face flushed with forced joviality. "My king," Holstead boomed, offering a deep bow. He turned his gaze to Freya, his smile not reaching his eyes. And Lady Freya. A striking ensemble. Though one hopes we are here to dance, not to repel a siege. A few of the western lords chuckled nervously. Alaric stopped. The ambient noise in the hall died instantly. The king did not look amused. He looked at Holstead the way a hawk looks at a field mouse. Before Alaric could speak, Freya stepped forward. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "The winter does not care if we are dancing." "Lord Holstead," Freya said, her voice carrying clearly over the silence. "The cold cuts through silk just as easily as a blade. I wear steel to remind the court that our safety is bought with iron, not with wine." She met his gaze directly. "If the western lords find that barbaric, perhaps they should patrol the crags next season." Holstead's smile vanished. He opened his mouth to retort, but he caught the look in Alaric's eye. The king's hand had casually drifted to the pommel of his dagger. Holstead swallowed hard, bowed stiffly, and retreated into the crowd. Nico watched the exchange from across the room. He saw the way the vanguard warriors, Braum, Garrick, and the others, nodded in grim approval at Freya's words. He saw the way his father looked at her, not as a political pawn, but as an equal. Nico realized then that he had not just rejected a tracker. He had rejected the very soul of Ethgard. Alaric turned to Freya. He extended his hand. "Dance with me," the king commanded. Freya placed her hand in his. He pulled her flush against his chest, mindful of her healing ribs. The musicians struck up a slow, rhythmic drumbeat layered with a haunting string melody. As they moved across the stone floor, Alaric leaned down, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. "You gutted Holstead with a sentence. I am deeply impressed." "I learned from watching you," Freya replied, looking up into his golden eyes. Alaric stopped dancing, right in the center of the great hall, under the gaze of hundreds of wolves. He framed her face with his large, scarred hands. "The severing is dead," Alaric said, his voice a low vibration that only she could hear, yet the intensity of it radiated outward. The earth made a mistake. I am fixing it." He did not wait for her to answer. He tilted her head to the side, exposing the long, pale line of her throat. A gasp rippled through the hall. Alaric's eyes flashed a brilliant, predatory gold. His canines descended. He buried his teeth into the crook of her neck, right over her pulse point. The pain was sharp, but it was instantly swallowed by a rush of pure, white-hot fire. It was not the magical, invisible tether of a fated bond. It was raw, physical, and permanent. He was claiming her blood, tying his soul to hers in front of the goddess and the entire pack. Freya arched into him, her hands fisting in his heavy velvet cloak. The hollow space in her chest slammed shut, locked tight behind iron and fire. She was not the severed girl crying in the mud anymore. She was whole. Alaric pulled back, licking a drop of blood from his lip. He looked down at the mating mark he had just carved into her skin, healing rapidly into a pale silver scar. He turned, keeping her tucked against his side, and faced his stunned court. "Behold your Luna." Alaric's voice boomed like thunder, chosen by the king, bound by blood, unbreakable. The great hall erupted. The vanguard warriors slammed their fists against their chests, howling their approval. The sound echoed off the stone vaulting, a primitive, terrifying endorsement. Even Nico lowered his head, finally submitting to the reality of the earth, the mud, and the Iron Throne. Freya looked out at the sea of bowing wolves, then up at the scarred, brutal man who stood beside her. He had claimed her to save his pack. She had accepted him to survive, but as the howls shook the keep, Freya knew the truth. They had not just survived, they had conquered. The severed tracker did not just survive the mud, she claimed the throne, by choosing grit over gold. Freya and the Alpha King forged a bond stronger than any fickle fate the earth could offer. Nico learned the hard way that a pack relies on iron, not silk. And Ethgard finally has a queen who knows how to bite back.